Imagine standing at the edge of Europe, looking south across a narrow strip of water. On the other side, Africa. Behind you, the vast continent of Europe stretching all the way to Russia. And beneath your feet, a peninsula that has been fought over, bled over, prayed over, and written about for 3,000 years. This is Iberia. This is Spain. And the story of how it became what it is today involves more drama, more conquest, more tragedy, and more unlikely triumph than almost any other nation on earth. We are talking about a land that gave Rome two of its greatest emperors. That built the first truly global empire in history. That produced Cervantes, Goya, Picasso, and Velázquez. That fell into one of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century, lived under a dictatorship for nearly 4 decades, and then, peacefully, remarkably, transformed itself into a modern democracy within a single generation. How does all of that happen to one country? Let's find out. The story begins long before anyone called this place Spain. Tens of thousands of years ago, human beings were already living on the Iberian Peninsula, and they were doing something extraordinary. Deep inside the caves of Altamira in northern Spain, they were painting. These paintings, created around 36,000 years ago, are among the oldest and most sophisticated works of art ever discovered. Bison, deer, horses, painted with such skill and such life that when a Spanish archaeologist first presented them to the scientific community in the 1880s, he was laughed out of the room. Experts simply refused to believe that prehistoric humans were capable of such beauty. They were wrong. By the first millennium BC, the peninsula is home to a rich tapestry of peoples. The Iberians along the Mediterranean coast. The Celts across the north and west. A mysterious and wealthy civilization in the southwest called Tartessos, believed by some historians to be the biblical Tarshish, a place so rich in silver and gold that legends grew up around it across the ancient world. Then come the Phoenicians, establishing trading posts along the coast. Then the Greeks. Then the Carthaginians, who arrived not just to trade but to conquer. And with the Carthaginians comes a name that should ring a bell. Hannibal Barca. Yes, that Hannibal. The general who marched war elephants over the Alps and nearly brought Rome to its knees. He didn't emerge from nowhere. He was shaped by Spain. His father Hamilcar Barca had conquered large parts of the Iberian Peninsula and built a Carthaginian empire there. Hannibal grew up in that world, and when the Second Punic War broke out between Carthage and Rome, it was Spain that was the launching pad, the recruiting ground, and one of the main prizes. In the end, Rome won? It always seemed to. Rome called the peninsula Hispania, and for nearly 700 years, it would be one of the most important provinces in the entire Roman world. What Rome did to Hispania was nothing short of transformative. They built roads that connected every corner of the peninsula, roads so well constructed that some of their routes are still used today. They built aqueducts of breathtaking engineering. The aqueduct of Segovia, which still stands in the heart of the city, was constructed without a drop of mortar. Just precisely cut granite blocks, fitted together with such accuracy that gravity alone holds them in place 2,000 years later. When you stand beneath it and look up at those towering arches, it is genuinely difficult to process that Roman engineers built this before the birth of Christ. They built amphitheaters, temples, forums, cities. Mérida, in the west of Spain, was one of the most important Roman cities in the Western Empire. Its ruins today, the amphitheater, the Roman bridge, the theater, are extraordinary. But Hispania didn't just receive Roman civilization. It gave back enormously. 2 of Rome's greatest emperors came from Hispania. Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest ever extent, and Hadrian, his successor, who consolidated and organized it, and who built that famous wall across the north of Britain. Both born in what is now Spain. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, one of the most widely read thinkers in the ancient world, came from Córdoba. The poet Martial, the rhetorician Quintilian, all Spanish Romans who shaped Latin culture. Hispania was not a backwater. It was, in many ways, a jewel of the Roman world. And then, as always, things began to fall apart. By the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire is crumbling under the pressure of economic collapse, political instability, and the relentless pressure of barbarian peoples pushing in from the north and east. One by one, the borders give way. Into Hispania pour the Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans. And then the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had been allies of Rome and who now step into the vacuum Rome leaves behind. The Visigoths rule Hispania for about 2.5 centuries. They adopt Latin. They convert to Christianity. They build a kingdom with its capital at Toledo. It is imperfect, politically unstable, riven by internal power struggles. But it holds. Until 711 AD, when everything changes overnight. In that year, a Muslim army crosses the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa. They are a mix of Berber and Arab soldiers, fired by the energy of a new religion that has, in less than a century, swept from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa and is now looking north. Their commander is a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad. He gives his name to the rock he lands at, Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which is where we get the word Gibraltar. The Visigoth kingdom collapses almost immediately. Within 7 years, the Muslim forces control the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula. Only in the very far north, in the rugged mountains of Asturias, does a small Christian remnant hold out. From this tiny redoubt, a process will begin that takes 700 years to complete. But before we get to that, let us talk about what the Moors actually built. Because this part of the story is often glossed over, and it absolutely should not be. Al-Andalus, as the Muslim-controlled parts of Iberia were known, became one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the medieval world. At its peak in the 10th century, the city of Córdoba had a population of around 1 million people. 1 million. At a time when London had perhaps 10,000. Paris perhaps 20,000. Córdoba had street lighting. It had running water and sewage systems. It had dozens of public libraries, one of which held an estimated 400,000 books at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe held perhaps a few hundred manuscripts. It had hospitals with surgical facilities. It had a philosophical and scientific culture that was preserving and advancing the knowledge of ancient Greece at precisely the moment when much of Europe had lost access to it. The architecture alone is staggering. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, with its forest of 800 columns and alternating red and white stone, is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. The Alhambra Palace complex in Granada, with its intricate geometric tilework, its water channels running through every room, its poetry literally carved into the walls, is a monument to what human beings can achieve when a civilization is at the height of its confidence and creativity. And this was not simply a story of conquest and oppression. For long stretches of this period, Muslims, Christians and Jews lived alongside one another in a degree of tolerance that was genuinely unusual for the medieval world. Scholars of all three faiths collaborated. Ideas flowed between communities. The Spanish have a word for it, convivencia, coexistence. It was fragile. It was imperfect. There were periods of violence and persecution. But it was also real. And the knowledge that was generated and preserved in Al-Andalus during this period would eventually flow northward into Europe and help ignite the Renaissance. Meanwhile, in the north, the Christian kingdoms are growing. From that original mountain redoubt in Asturias, a slow expansion begins. It takes centuries. It is not a single crusade but rather an endlessly complicated process of military campaigns, political marriages, shifting alliances, betrayals, and occasional moments of extraordinary heroism. The most famous figure of this period is El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. A Castilian knight who was exiled by his own king, went off to fight for Muslim rulers for a time, then ended up conquering Valencia for himself. He is a genuinely fascinating figure because he defies the simple narrative of Christian versus Muslim that later historians tried to impose on this period. He fought for whoever paid him and whoever he judged worthy. He is Spain's national hero and he is deeply, gloriously complicated. The Reconquista accelerates over time. Toledo falls to the Christians in 1085. Córdoba in 1236. Seville in 1248. By the late 15th century, all that remains of Moorish Spain is the Kingdom of Granada in the south. And then comes the moment that ties everything together. In 1469, an 18-year-old woman named Isabella of Castile marries a 17-year-old man named Ferdinand of Aragon. This marriage unites the two most powerful Christian kingdoms on the peninsula. They are a formidable pair, politically sharp, militarily ambitious, deeply devout, and utterly convinced of their mission. In 1492, and this single year carries more historical weight than almost any other, three things happen. First, Ferdinand and Isabella conquer Granada. The Reconquista is complete. For the first time, the entire Iberian Peninsula is under Christian rule. Second, they issue the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. Between 150,000 and 200,000 people are forced from their homes, their businesses, their communities, the places their families have lived for generations. It is a catastrophic act of religious persecution, and it deprives Spain of some of its most educated, skilled and commercially capable people at the exact moment it is about to become a global power. Third, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who has been trying for years to get backing for his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, finally gets his funding. He sails in August 1492. He lands in the Caribbean in October 1492. And the world is never the same again. The Spanish Empire that follows is unlike anything the world has seen before. It is the first truly global empire in history. At its height under King Philip II in the late 16th century, it controls territories in the Americas from the tip of Patagonia to the deserts of what is now the American Southwest. It controls the Philippines. It controls large parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and for a time Portugal and its own vast empire in Brazil and Africa. The sun, quite literally, never sets on it. The engine of this empire is silver. The mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, are the most productive silver mines in history. At their peak they are producing something like 60% of the entire world's silver supply. Imagine that. More than half of all the silver on Earth is coming out of one mountain in South America, being loaded onto galleons, sailing across the Atlantic, and arriving in Spain. This extraordinary wealth funds wars, builds palaces, commissions art, and turns Madrid into one of the great capital cities of Europe. The Spanish Golden Age, the Siglo de Oro, produces Cervantes, who writes Don Quixote, widely considered the first modern novel. It produces the painters Velázquez and El Greco and Zurbarán. It is a period of extraordinary cultural flowering. But the human cost of building this empire is monstrous. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés and the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro are stories that can be told as tales of astonishing military audacity, tiny forces defeating empires of millions. But they are also stories of systematic violence, enslavement, and the deliberate destruction of ancient civilizations. And then there is disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to European illnesses. Smallpox, measles, influenza swept through populations that had never encountered them. The death toll is almost impossible to comprehend. By some estimates, the indigenous population of the Americas fell by up to 90% in the century following first contact. Entire peoples were wiped from the earth. Languages, histories, knowledge systems, ways of understanding the world, gone. The Spanish Empire made Spain extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily powerful. It also made Spain complicit in one of the greatest human catastrophes in history. Empires do not last forever. By the late 17th century, the warning signs are everywhere. The flood of American silver has actually made Spain economically complacent. Rather than building industries and developing its own economy, Spain simply spent the money as it arrived. When the silver started to slow, there was nothing to replace it. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in 1588, that famous story of the great fleet battered by storms and English fire ships, had signaled the beginning of the end of Spanish naval supremacy. The long, grinding wars in the Netherlands drained the treasury. The succession crisis at the start of the 18th century brings a new royal dynasty, the Bourbons, and drags Spain into the War of Spanish Succession, another ruinously expensive conflict. Then Napoleon. In 1808, Through a combination of bullying and diplomatic manipulation, Napoleon maneuvers the Spanish royal family out of power and installs his own brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish are furious. What follows is the Peninsular War, 5 years of some of the most brutal and vicious fighting in European history. Spanish resistance fighters wage a savage guerrilla campaign against the French forces. Hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, enters the English language from this conflict. The British, under the Duke of Wellington, fight alongside the Spanish. Together they grind Napoleon's forces down. The painter Francisco Goya witnesses and documents the horrors. His series of prints called The Disasters of War, and his paintings such as the 3rd of May 1808, showing French soldiers executing Spanish civilians, are among the most powerful anti-war artworks ever created. They are raw, unflinching, and utterly modern in their refusal to glorify violence. Napoleon is eventually defeated, but Spain emerges from the war traumatized and exhausted. And over the following decades, the Spanish colonies in the Americas seize their moment. One by one, they declare independence. Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Peru. The empire dissolves. By 1898, after a short and humiliating war against the United States, Spain loses its last significant colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. It is over. 3 centuries of empire, gone. The Spanish call this moment el disaster, the disaster, and the national soul-searching that follows poisons Spanish politics for the next 4 decades. What went wrong? Who is to blame? How can Spain recover? These questions fuel bitter divisions between conservatives and progressives, between the church and secularists, between regions demanding autonomy and a central government desperate to hold the country together. The pressure builds, and in July 1936, it explodes. The Spanish Civil War is one of the defining conflicts of the 20th century. Not just because of its scale and savagery, but because of what it represents, a collision of all the great ideological forces tearing the world apart in that era. A military uprising, led by General Francisco Franco and other conservative officers, rises against the democratically elected Republican government. Within days, Spain is split. The nationalists, Franco's side, control parts of the south, west, and north. The Republicans control Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, much of the east and center. What follows is 3 years of savage, merciless conflict. This is not a clean war between armies. It is a war that reaches into every village, every family. Neighbors denounce neighbors. Priests are killed by anarchist militias. Suspected leftists are rounded up and shot by nationalist forces. The estimated death toll ranges from 500,000 to 1 million people, and that does not count the hundreds of thousands who die in the repression that follows. The war becomes a stage for a global ideological struggle. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy send men, planes, and weapons to support Franco. The Soviet Union sends advisors and supplies to the Republic, while also tightening its grip on the Republican government in ways that destroy morale and create internal purges. From around the world, tens of thousands of volunteers, the international brigades, traveled to Spain to fight for the Republic. Writers and intellectuals among them. George Orwell, who fights with the Trotskyist militia in Catalonia and writes about it in Homage to Catalonia, one of the finest books ever written about war and political disillusionment. Ernest Hemingway, who covers the war as a journalist and draws on it for Whom the Bell Tolls. Many of them believe this is the front line against fascism. If Spain falls, they fear, the rest of Europe is next. In April 1937, their fears find a horrifying symbol. German aircraft from the Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica. A market day, civilians crowding the streets, simply to test the effectiveness of aerial bombardment on an urban population and to spread terror. Hundreds die. The world is shocked. Pablo Picasso, living in Paris, responds within weeks. He produces a vast, monochrome canvas, 11 feet tall, 25 feet wide, of screaming horses, dismembered bodies, A mother howling over a dead child, a soldier's shattered arms still clutching a broken sword. Guernica. It is one of the most powerful works of art in human history, and it hangs in Madrid today as a permanent reminder of what human beings do to each other in war. Franco wins. In early 1939, Republican resistance collapses. Hundreds of thousands of refugees flee across the border into France. Many spend years in internment camps. Franco enters Madrid. Spain goes dark. Francisco Franco rules Spain as dictator from 1939 until his death in November 1975. 36 years. An entire generation. His regime is built on repression and fear. In the years immediately following the Civil War, tens of thousands of Republicans are executed. Many more are imprisoned, sent to labor camps, or forced into exile. Regional identities are crushed. The Catalan and Basque languages are banned from public life. The Catholic Church becomes a pillar of the state. Censorship is absolute. Spain turns inward, isolated, gray. For most of the 1940s and 1950s, Spain is one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. The economy is stagnant. Rationing continues well into the 1950s. People are hungry. Talented Spaniards leave. Only in the 1960s, as Franco cautiously opened Spain to foreign investment and tourism, does the economy begin to grow. The sun-drenched beaches of the Costa del Sol begin to fill with northern European tourists. Money flows in. A Spanish middle class slowly emerges. But political freedom remains as distant as ever. When Franco dies on the 20th of November 1975, there is genuine fear about what comes next. Spain has no recent tradition of stable democracy. The Civil War is still raw in living memory. Many expect chaos. Some fear another conflict. What happens instead is one of the most remarkable political transitions in modern history. King Juan Carlos I, whom Franco had personally groomed to continue his regime, surprises everyone. Rather than preserving the dictatorship, he actively supports democratic reform. He appoints Adolfo Suarez as prime minister. Suarez, a man who had himself been a senior official in the Franco regime, begins negotiating with opposition parties, including the Communist Party, to build a path to democracy. In 1977, the first free elections in 40 years are held. In 1978, a new democratic constitution is approved by referendum. Spain becomes a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy. There is a crisis in 1981 when a group of army officers storm the parliament building with submachine guns and attempt a coup. The country holds its breath. King Juan Carlos goes on television and unambiguously condemns the coup. The military stands down. Democracy holds. Spain joins the European Community in 1986. Hosts the Olympics in Barcelona in 1992. Holds the World Expo in Seville in the same year. The transformation is extraordinary. A country that 40 years earlier had been a fascist dictatorship with a ruined economy is now a thriving, creative, open, democratic society taking its place at the heart of Europe. So what is Spain? It is the cave paintings at Altamira, made by human hands 36,000 years ago, speaking to us across an almost incomprehensible gulf of time. It is the aqueduct of Segovia, still standing after 2 millennia, a monument to what people can build when they combine ambition with skill. It is the Alhambra, floating above Granada in the evening light, a palace built by a civilization that was, for several centuries, the most sophisticated in the Western world. It is the silver of Potosi and the horror of the conquest, and the impossible wealth, and the terrible cost. It is Goya painting the darkness of war with a clarity that no one before him had dared. It is Picasso turning grief and outrage into something that will outlast us all. It is flamenco, which contains within it the echoes of Moorish music and Romani traditions and Andalusian folk song, a whole history compressed into a single art form. It is a country that has been conquered so many times that conquest is written into its DNA. That has built empires and lost them. That has reached the heights of global power and fallen back to earth. That has experienced dictatorship within living memory and chosen, deliberately, peacefully, courageously, to build something better. There is no single story of Spain. There are thousands of them, layered one on top of the other across 30 centuries, each one pressing down on the ones beneath, each one still visible if you know where to look. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it one of the great subjects in all of history.